The night was unforgiving, with rain lashing against the windows of the small cabin nestled deep in the woods. Thunder cracked through the air, and the wind howled like a wild beast, shaking the trees outside. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fireplace provided some comfort to the family of three: Jack, his wife Sarah, and their teenage daughter Emily. They had braced for the storm, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to face. As lightning illuminated the dark forest outside, a faint, almost haunting sound broke through the storm's fury. It was a cry, desperate, high-pitched, and filled with fear. Jack paused mid-conversation, tilting his head toward the noise. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice edged with concern. Emily nodded, her wide eyes glancing toward the window. The cries came again, growing louder, more urgent. Whatever was out there wasn't just fighting the storm, it was begging for help. Grabbing a flashlight and their raincoats, Jack and Emily ventured outside, braving the cold rain and swirling wind. Sarah stayed behind, worry etched on her face as she watched them disappear into the night. The forest was a blur of shadows and movement as the storm raged on, but the cries guided them. Flashlight beams cut through the downpour, and after a few tense moments, they spotted it. A small, trembling figure huddled beneath a bush. It was a bear cub, drenched and shivering, its ribs visible beneath its soaked fur. The cub let out another pitiful cry, its wide, frightened eyes locking onto Jack and Emily. Emily gasped, her heart breaking at the sight. "Dad, it's just a baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. Jack hesitated, torn between the instinct to help and the knowledge of the risks involved. Bears, even cubs, were wild animals, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But as the cub let out another cry, weaker this time, he made his decision. "We can't leave it like this," Jack said firmly, stepping closer. He carefully removed his jacket and draped it over the cub, shielding it from the rain. Emily knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she gently stroked the cub's wet fur. "You're safe now?" she whispered, her voice filled with determination. The storm continued to roar around them as they carried the cub back toward the cabin. They didn't know how the night would unfold, but one thing was certain: their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't have imagined. The storm had raged across the forest for hours, leaving destruction in its wake. Trees were uprooted, streams had swelled into roaring rivers, and the ground had turned into a muddy quagmire. For most creatures, the storm was a battle to endure, but for the tiny bear cub, it was a fight for survival. Separated from its mother earlier in the day, the cub had been left to fend for itself. The floodwaters had rushed through their den, forcing the mother bear to flee, her cub trailing behind. But in the chaos, the young bear had fallen behind, its small legs unable to keep up with the powerful strides of its mother. One moment, it had been following her scent. The next, it was alone, the storm swallowing every trace of her. As the rain poured down in relentless sheets, the cub stumbled through the forest, its tiny frame no match for the harsh conditions. Each step was a struggle as its paws sank into the muddy ground, making it harder to move forward. The sharp wind cut through its wet fur, and every crack of thunder sent it flinching and whimpering. It was cold, hungry, and utterly terrified. The cub's cries echoed through the storm, but they were lost in the howling wind. It stumbled across fallen branches and pools of water, its energy fading with every passing moment. At one point, the cub found a hollow under a large bush and crawled inside, seeking shelter from the torrential rain. But the bush offered little protection, and the rain continued to seep through, soaking its already trembling body. Its stomach growled painfully, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since it had eaten. The cub had no idea how to forage for food on its own. It was far too young. All it could do was cry out, hoping its mother would hear and come to its rescue. But no help came. As the hours dragged on, the cub's cries grew weaker, its tiny frame heaving with exhaustion. It rested its head on the muddy ground, too tired to move. Every instinct told it to keep fighting, but its body was giving up. The storm showed no mercy, and the cub's hope of finding safety was fading fast. Just as the cub's cries dwindled to a faint whimper, a beam of light pierced through the rain. The cub lifted its head weakly, its wide eyes reflecting the glow. It let out one last pitiful cry, not knowing if it would be heard. But it was. Through the darkness, two figures approached, their voices muffled by the storm. The cub blinked slowly, too exhausted to react. It didn't understand who they were or why they had come, but for the first time since the storm began, it wasn't alone. Jack and Emily stood on the porch, the drenched bear cub wrapped snugly in Jack's jacket, its small body trembling from the cold. Rain poured off the edges of the roof, and thunder rumbled in the distance, but their focus was entirely on the fragile creature in their arms. Its cries had softened, replaced by shallow, uneven breaths. Inside the cabin, Sarah paced anxiously, peeking out the window at her husband and daughter. When they stepped inside, carrying the cub, her eyes widened. "You brought it here?" she asked, her voice a mixture of concern and disbelief. "It's a wild animal, Jack. We don't know what we're dealing with." Jack placed the cub carefully on a blanket by the fire, its tiny frame barely making an imprint. "Look at it, Sarah," he said, gesturing toward the cub. "It's starving, freezing, and alone. It won't make it through the night out there." Emily knelt beside the cub, her face filled with determination. "We can't just leave it to die, Mom," she said softly. She gently brushed the wet fur from the cub's face, her eyes glistening with emotion. "It's just a baby. We have to do something." Sarah folded her arms, torn between her maternal instinct to protect her family and the compassion welling up inside her. "What if the mother is out there looking for it? What if she comes here?" she asked, glancing toward the window, as though expecting a large bear to appear at any moment. Jack sighed, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. If the mother was close, she would have found it by now. It's been alone for hours, maybe longer. The storm's only getting worse. He turned to Sarah, his voice firm but kind. "We'll keep it safe for tonight. Once the storm clears, we'll figure out what to do." Sarah hesitated, her gaze shifting between her husband and the cub. It let out a faint whimper, curling into the blanket as though trying to disappear. The sight tugged at her heart. She had seen the storm's destruction firsthand, and deep down she knew Jack was right. The cub wouldn't survive another night in the wild. "All right," she said at last, her voice softening. "But just for tonight. We can't keep it here for long. It's not safe for us or for the cub." Emily beamed and carefully placed a second blanket over the cub, her hands gentle and deliberate. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. Sarah knelt beside Emily, her fingers brushing over the cub's damp fur. "We'll do what we can," she said, her tone now tinged with quiet resolve. "But we have to be careful." The family worked together to care for the cub. Jack warmed a small bowl of milk and offered it to the bear, who hesitated before lapping at it weakly. Emily stayed by its side, whispering soothing words as the cub finally began to relax. As the storm raged on outside, the family watched over the cub, knowing they had made the right choice. It wasn't just about saving a life, it was about compassion, a value they all shared, and one that would guide their decisions in the days to come. As the storm continued to roar outside, the family turned their attention to the cub lying by the fireplace. Wrapped in a soft blanket, its tiny frame trembled as it tried to absorb the warmth. Emily knelt beside it, her fingers gently stroking the damp fur. "You're safe now," she whispered softly. The cub lifted its head slightly, its wide, frightened eyes meeting hers before it let out a faint whimper. Jack sat down on the floor next to them, holding a bowl of warm milk. "Let's see if it'll drink this," he said, carefully placing the bowl near the cub's nose. The little bear sniffed at it hesitantly, its instincts taking over as it began to lap at the milk. Emily smiled, watching the cub's trembling subside slightly as it consumed the much-needed nourishment. "It must be starving," Emily said, her voice filled with both sadness and relief. "It's so small. I can't believe it survived this long out there." Sarah, standing nearby with her arms crossed, observed the scene with a mixture of caution and quiet compassion. "We need to be careful," she said. "It's still a wild animal, and we don't know what condition it's in." Jack nodded. "You're right, but right now, it just needs warmth and food. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." The cub finished the milk and rested its head back down, clearly exhausted. Emily took a dry towel and carefully patted the cub's fur, trying to dry it off as much as possible. The little bear didn't resist. Its energy was spent, and it seemed to trust the gentle hands that cared for it. As the night went on, the family worked together to create a safe space for the cub. Jack used an old crate and some blankets to make a makeshift bed near the fireplace, ensuring the cub stayed warm through the cold night. Emily stayed by its side, occasionally stroking its fur and whispering words of comfort. The cub began to relax, its small body curling up in the blanket as the warmth of the fire soothed its shivers. Slowly, its breathing became steadier, its soft whimpers fading into quiet, rhythmic sounds. Watching this, Emily couldn't help but feel a growing connection to the bear. "I think it trusts us now," she said, glancing at her parents. Jack smiled faintly, though his expression was tinged with concern. "It's a good sign, but we need to remember, it's not ours to keep. Once the storm passes, we'll have to make sure it finds its way back where it belongs." Emily nodded, though her heart ached at the thought. "I know, but for now, we're all it has." Sarah sighed, finally sitting down beside them. "You're both right," she said, her tone softening. "We can't turn our backs on it now. Let's just focus on helping it get through tonight." The hours passed quietly as the family took turns checking on the cub. At one point, the bear stirred and let out a small, soft growl, not of fear, but almost as if it was content. Emily couldn't help but smile, leaning closer. "You're going to be okay, little one," she whispered. The bond between the family and the cub began to grow, forged by their shared fight against the storm and the fragility of the moment. For Jack and Sarah, it was a reminder of their shared values: compassion, resilience, and the importance of taking care of those who can't care for themselves. For Emily, it was something deeper, a connection to the wild, a sense of purpose in protecting a life that might otherwise have been lost. As the storm outside began to wane, the cub finally drifted into a deep sleep, its small body rising and falling steadily. The family gathered around it, the quiet hum of the fireplace filling the room. In that moment, they weren't just caring for the cub, they were caring for something far greater: hope, resilience, and the enduring spirit of compassion. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled relentlessly, slamming rain against the windows of the family's cabin, and the faint flicker of the fireplace seemed to be their only comfort. Inside, the family sat close to the bear cub, who was now bundled in blankets and resting by the fire. Though its tiny body had stopped trembling, its quiet whimpers hinted at its lingering fear. As Jack placed another log on the fire, the lights in the cabin suddenly flickered. The family froze, their eyes darting to the ceiling as the faint hum of electricity wavered. Then, with a final pop, the room went dark. "Great," Jack muttered under his breath, grabbing a flashlight. Sarah hurried to the kitchen to find candles, while Emily moved closer to the cub. The storm outside seemed louder now, as though the power outage had stripped away any sense of safety. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at the cub, whose wide eyes reflected the firelight. It let out a soft cry, as if it could sense the tension in the room. "We manage," Jack said firmly, handing Emily a flashlight. "We've been through storms like this before. We'll be fine." But the storm wasn't their only concern. As Jack peered out the window, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten: fresh paw prints in the mud outside the cabin. They were large, deep, and unmistakable. A full-grown bear had passed through recently. He didn't say anything at first, not wanting to alarm his family, but Sarah caught the way his expression changed. "What is it?" she asked, joining him at the window. When she saw the tracks, her face paled. "Do you think it's the cub's mother?" she whispered, glancing back at the small bear curled up near the fire. "It's possible," Jack replied, his voice low. "But it could also be another bear. Either way, we need to stay alert." The thought of a larger bear roaming nearby added a new layer of tension to the night. The family took turns keeping watch, their ears straining to hear anything unusual over the sound of the storm. The cub, restless and anxious, let out soft cries every so often, as if calling for its mother. Each cry sent a chill through the family. They knew it could draw attention to their cabin. As the hours dragged on, the storm intensified. Branches snapped outside, and the sound of something heavy falling echoed through the forest. Jack stood at the window, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. "Let's keep the fire low," he said quietly, "just in case." Meanwhile, Emily stayed close to the cub, stroking its fur to calm it. "You'll be okay," she whispered, though her own heart raced. She couldn't help but feel torn. While she desperately wanted the cub to find its mother, the idea of a fully grown bear approaching the cabin was terrifying. The family huddled together, the storm raging around them, and the unknown looming just outside. Every sound, every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt amplified. They were doing everything they could to protect the cub. But they couldn't shake the fear that the storm wasn't the only challenge they would face that night. As dawn approached and the storm began to ease, the family felt a small glimmer of relief. The cub had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, its cries quieted. But the paw prints outside the cabin remained a stark reminder of the challenges still to come. They knew the morning would bring new decisions and possibly new dangers, but for now, they were grateful to have made it through the night together. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the forest that had endured the storm's wrath. The wind had calmed, and the relentless pounding of rain had finally given way to a peaceful, dripping silence. Inside the cabin, the family stirred from a restless night. The bear cub was still curled up near the fireplace, its small chest rising and falling in steady breaths, finally at peace. Jack was the first to step outside. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of wet earth. His boots sank into the muddy ground as he surveyed the damage. Fallen branches littered the area, and the small stream near their cabin had swollen into a fast-moving creek. The forest bore the scars of the storm, but it was quiet now, almost too quiet. Emily joined him on the porch, the cub tucked in her arms, its head poking out from the blanket. It had grown more comfortable with her during the night, nuzzling her whenever it felt restless. She looked out at the forest, her expression a mix of wonder and worry. "Do you think its mom is out there?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning the trees. Jack nodded toward the edge of the forest, where the soft mud showed fresh tracks. "Could be," he said. "I saw these last night. They're definitely from a bear, likely an adult. If it's the mother, she might still be close." The cub stirred in Emily's arms, letting out a small whimper. It looked toward the forest, its wide eyes searching, as though it too was hoping to see a familiar figure emerge. Emily felt her chest tighten. "We have to help it find her," she said, her voice firm. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple. If the mother's nearby, we need to be careful. She could see us as a threat, especially since we've been with her cub." Sarah joined them on the porch, holding a thermos of coffee and scanning the forest. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. Jack glanced at the cub, then back at the tracks. "We'll take it to the edge of the forest, follow the tracks, and see if the mother's nearby. If we find her, we let the cub go. If not, we'll have to call wildlife rescue to take over." The family gathered their things and prepared for the trek. Emily wrapped the cub securely in her jacket and held it close as they walked toward the forest. The morning light filtered through the trees, illuminating the path ahead. The cub's small cries grew louder as they approached the tracks, as though it knew this was where it needed to be. Then, a sound broke the silence, a low growl from deeper in the woods. The family froze, their eyes darting toward the source. Emerging cautiously from the shadows was a large bear, its dark eyes fixed on them. The cub squirmed in Emily's arms, letting out a loud cry. The mother bear paused, then let out a responding growl, a sound of recognition and relief. Jack raised a hand, signaling everyone to stay still. Slowly, Emily knelt down and set the cub on the ground. The little bear hesitated, looking back at her one last time before toddling toward its mother. The reunion was brief, but emotional. The mother bear nuzzled the cub protectively before turning and leading it back into the woods. The family watched in silence as the bears disappeared into the forest, their hearts heavy yet full. The storm had brought the cub to them, and now it had brought it back to where it belonged. Emily wiped away a tear, smiling faintly. "We did the right thing," she whispered. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. "Yeah, we did," he said. "Let's head home." As they walked back to the cabin, the morning sun broke fully over the horizon, washing the forest in golden light. Though the storm had passed, its impact would remain, a reminder of the resilience of life and the power of compassion. The family walked quietly through the forest, following the bear tracks that led deeper into the trees. The storm had left its mark. Muddy paths, broken branches, and puddles of water scattered across the ground. Jack held a flashlight even in the dim morning light, scanning the area for any signs of the cub's mother. Emily carried the cub in her arms, its small cries growing louder as they approached the edge of the forest. "I think it knows something," Emily said softly, glancing down at the cub. Its tiny head poked out of the blanket, and its wide eyes scanned the trees, as if sensing its mother's presence. Jack stopped and raised his hand. "Wait," he whispered. Everyone froze. A low growl echoed through the forest, distant but unmistakable. Sarah instinctively moved closer to Emily, her eyes darting toward the sound. From behind the thick trees, a large figure began to emerge, a fully grown bear, cautiously stepping forward. Its fur was damp, and its powerful frame moved with slow, deliberate steps. The mother bear's eyes locked onto the cub in Emily's arms, and it let out another growl, not of aggression but of warning. "It's her," Jack said firmly, his voice low. "Stay calm." Emily hesitated, looking down at the cub, who was now squirming in her arms, letting out louder cries. "It's okay," she whispered to the little bear, her heart pounding. Slowly, she knelt down and set the cub on the ground. The cub hesitated, glancing back at Emily as if unsure whether to stay or go. "Go on," she said gently, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's here for you." The cub took a tentative step forward, then another. Its cries grew more insistent as it toddled toward the larger bear. The mother bear let out a deep, rumbling sound and lowered her head, sniffing the air as the cub approached. When they finally reached each other, the mother bear nuzzled the cub, pulling it close with her massive paw. The cub let out a soft, high-pitched cry, pressing against its mother's chest. The family watched in silence, the emotional reunion unfolding before their eyes. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek as she watched the bears. "She found her," she whispered. The sight was both heartwarming and bittersweet, a moment of closure for the journey they had shared with the cub. The mother bear looked up at the humans one last time, her gaze lingering for a brief moment. Then, with her cub safely by her side, she turned and disappeared into the forest, her large frame blending into the shadows. The family stood there for a few moments, the forest now eerily quiet. "We did the right thing," Jack said, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. Emily nodded, a faint smile breaking through her sadness. "She's where she belongs now." As they turned to head back home, the morning sunlight began to filter through the trees, casting a warm glow over the path. It was a moment they would never forget, a reminder of the power of compassion and the bonds that connect all living Bay.